Okay, I just want to introduce you to the chair for our last session for the day. And we have with us from the head of our surveillance platform in Tern, Associate Professor Ben Sparrow. And Ben is pretty special in this country because of developing a totally brand new methodology for the world on how to do continental scale surveying across the country. So thank you very much, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Sparrow. Right, so the last session for the day, and we've had some really interesting talks. Hopefully we'll continue there for the next last session before the end of the day. The session's called About Data, but having a quick skim of the abstracts, I think it's perhaps more than just about data. It's about how can we extract knowledge and information from data in new and innovative ways. And so a couple of things I'm expecting to see from the team today is really innovative uses, ways that we're seeing data now used that perhaps we hadn't anticipated when we started off on our journey 15 years ago. And also the use of data across many different scales and many aspects of Tern all together to maximise benefit. So that's probably enough from me. So if Simon, you can head up for your session, that would be awesome.
Thanks, Ben, and that's a really good introduction to what I want to talk about. But first of all, can I join others in acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on, the Turrbal and Jagera people. The other thing I wanted to say up front is originally there were going to be 3 presentations at this symposium on this topic, this Tern activity that we're involved with. We are missing the middle of those presentations because Andrew Hoskins wasn't able to make it in the end to the symposium. So it's a bit like reading a novel of 3 chapters and only having chapters 1 and 3. But I'll explain that a bit as we go further on. Okay, we've heard a lot today already about what I sometimes call the gold standard of biodiversity monitoring, and that's where people go to the same places repeatedly over time and apply the same survey protocol to those locations so they can report change over time. The Living Planet Index is a good example of this. At global scale, what am I doing wrong? There we go. And then, of course, we've heard about the Threatened Species Index within Australia. And these are wonderful initiatives, and I certainly don't want anything that I say to be construed as somehow being critical of those approaches. But what I want to talk about is there a way we can also extract greater value from a completely different kind of data stream? And that's this explosion of data where, rather than repeat visits to the same locations, people are essentially just recording wherever they happen to observe species, so sort of ad hoc or opportunistic observations of species across space and time. And of course there's been an explosion of this kind of data, largely as a result of citizen science smartphone apps and initiatives such as iNaturalist. And just how quickly these data are exploding, I think, is evidenced by the fact that chart I've got at the top right there is now a few years out of date. I understand that the total number of observations now sitting in iNaturalist is well over 200 million, just in the last couple of years. So these data can potentially, I would hope, add value to what can be done with that gold standard type of monitoring data, because these data can help provide even better coverage both across space and time, and also better taxonomic coverage, simply because these initiatives are tapping into this huge army of people who just want to go out there and just record species as they find them. But of course, the big problem with this source of data is its very unstructured nature. People, as I said before, people are not going to the same places and recording in the same way over time. So the data sets are riddled with sources of bias and noise and so on. Now, there have been lots of great efforts to address this with extending existing analytical approaches, things like multi-species occupancy models and so on. Most of these solutions, however, involve trying to turn unstructured data into structured data, and this is often done by sort of generalising the observations up to coarser grid cells and that kind of thing. But what I want to talk about today is a completely different strategy for analysing this kind of data. And this is derived from a technique that I've developed and worked with for 25 years now, called generalised dissimilarity modelling. And this normally works with modelling the turnover in community composition between pairs of locations in a landscape as a function of where those locations are, both in geographic and environmental space. But a few years back, my good colleague Andrew Hoskins and I extended this approach to work with what people often call presence-only data. And so here, to cut a very long story short, what we do is, instead of modelling, the response variable is not the community level compositional dissimilarity between pairs of locations, but it's actually, we're looking at pairs of individual species observations. And the response that's getting modelled is actually the probability that those two observations are of the same species or two different species. If this was an hour-long presentation, I could explain how this approach to modelling links directly into entropy-based theory of diversity and of biodiversity itself. So there are very strong links between this idea of the probability of drawing two things out of a system, being those two things being of the same type or two different types, that then links in very strongly to concepts of alpha and beta diversity. Okay, we then, some years ago, realised that we could do this not only across space, but also across time. So what we started exploring around 7 years ago now was the idea of using data mainly from the Atlas of Living Australia, just individual species observations, to see whether we could extract the signal of, at that time, climate change in impacting on biodiversity composition across the continent. So took masses of data for birds and plants at the time. I won't go into detail on this other than to say that it became clear that this kind of approach did in fact have potential to extract the signal of the impact of climate change on the distribution of plants and animals across the continent, and to extract that from these incredibly noisy presence-only data sets. The next phase of the story was we got some funding from Microsoft and GeoBon to do some more work on this technique, but that was very software focused. but it so happened that Beryl Morris was at a talk that I gave, where are you, Beryl, there, in Montreal almost 2 years ago now on this work, and came up to me afterwards and said that she really wanted to find a way of helping to fund continuation of this work. So that's where we are now. What are we doing in this Tern activity? A number of things. We're trialling the application of this analytical approach to unstructured species datasets, species occurrence datasets for Australia. That's what Andrew Hoskins was going to present some results of. Unfortunately, we're not going to hear that now. We are also using simulated data to test the rigour of the approach in the face of varying levels of data quality, quantity and sampling bias. Thankfully, we are hearing that presentation from Drew Terasaki-Hart, and I think that's in the last session tomorrow. We're also doing a lot of thinking and hopefully development in extending the approach to better account for variation in both beta and alpha diversity across both space and time. A lot of the focus to date has been on the beta diversity component, but we have some really good ideas about how to do the change in alpha as well within that. And then finally, we're exploring ways of using the results from this approach to modelling to not only help with the detection. Why have I gone forwards? Anyway, doesn't matter, I'll get to this one very soon. So this modelling approach can help both with detecting and attributing the drivers of change in biodiversity, but it can also feed in to helping to derive more rigorous indicators for reporting on biodiversity change. And I just wanted, aren't I up to a minute left already? No. Almost. Yeah, good. That's good. I just thought I might have missed it. So I just wanted to say something very quickly about what being able to fit these sorts of models across both space and time could contribute to the sorts of biodiversity indicators that our group does a lot of work on, and this is using our Bilby Global Biodiversity Modelling framework. And at the moment, that is very much underpinned by modelling biodiversity patterns across space alone and the drivers of those distributional patterns, and then using space for time substitution to then make predictions about how we think changes in those drivers will result in changes in biodiversity over time. With this new modelling approach of actually fitting models to biodiversity change across both space and time, that puts us in a position to be much more confident in how we apply those models to both, in the first case, interpreting how observed changes in drivers, particularly things like land use or ecosystem integrity, what we expect the consequences of those to be for change in species-level biodiversity. And just one example there of the Biodiversity Habitat Index. Stop. Okay. I'll be very quick. The Biodiversity Habitat Index, which is a component indicator for the GBF monitoring framework, which Emily was talking about earlier, that can benefit from the ability to work with models that are fitted over both space and time rather than space alone, and then also improving the rigour of the kind of work we've been doing for a long time now with projecting biodiversity changes into the future as a consequence of scenarios of global change in climate and land use, as well as potential policies. So I have been told to stop, and I will stop. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Today I'll be introducing a project in progress called the National Ecosystem Assessment System for Australia, or NISA project, supported by Tern and the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. First, I'd like to acknowledge the enduring connections that First Nations people have with country and pay our respects to their elders past and present. And I'll start with some background to the NISA project. The proposal for NISA includes a larger vision towards infrastructure that captures ecological data and expert knowledge to facilitate mapping, monitoring and prediction of the trajectories of Australian ecosystems. And the current project involves the first phase of this, to synthesise expert ecological knowledge to describe the natural dynamics of high integrity ecosystems across Australia and their modification and restoration dynamics under post-colonisation ecosystem management. And this work is driven by the growing commitment to nature positive initiatives by industry, government and communities globally, which has led to a pressing need for consistent methodologies for predicting and evaluating outcomes of land use change and ecological restoration interventions. So the project builds on earlier work developing the Australian Ecosystem Models Framework. As a quick reminder, the AusEco Models Framework accommodates templates for reference ecosystem dynamics in a set of about 50 archetype models for Australia. And these describe the high-level disturbance and recovery dynamics of ecosystems that have high integrity. That is, the disturbances that they've adapted to over evolutionary timeframes, including those driven by human actions, such as indigenous burning regimes. And here you can see examples of the booklets published so far, with another 11 underway through the NISA project. But today isn't actually about the archetype models. Rather, this talk focuses on the state and transition model component. And today I'll introduce 3 primary templates that we've developed as part of a broader methodology to facilitate consistency in development of state and transition models. And for those less familiar with state and transition models, here's a simple reminder. They're generally used to capture the key dynamics of an ecosystem of interest, typically including a reference state of high ecological integrity and a range of modified states and associated transitions between them, denoted by arrows. For each of these parts of the model, we're developing templates and typologies to guide the development of consistent state and transition models for regional and local applications. So before moving on, I'd first like to emphasise that this is a work in progress. It's arisen jointly from our work with DECU on the ecological knowledge system for the nature repair market and on the Tern NISA project, including a workshop held earlier this year that helped develop the templates I'll show today. And I'd like to thank the participants for their amazing engagement that is helping us towards these outputs. So when we started thinking about how to consistently describe modified ecosystem states, we started with the VAST framework shown here. And this is a framework put forward by Thackway and Leslie to express common transitions in Australian vegetation from what was called residual through to modified, transformed and replaced adventive, then to intensive land management and removed classes. And these classes have also been assigned condition scores using an expert elicitation approach. So we used the VAST framework as a starting point, first to develop templates for state and transition models in Australian forests and woodlands. In doing so, we recognised that we needed to expand the VAST framework because different vegetation strata can be modified somewhat independently than allowed in a simple linear trajectory. For example, overstory can be cut down whilst leaving understory relatively intact, like in our picture here. And similarly, overstory can remain relatively intact, while the understory is highly modified. So to accommodate these two key dimensions, we've explicitly allowed for different condition in overstory with these options on the left and understory on the right. And we're in the process of defining these categories from reference or close to reference through modified and highly modified or absent to what we're calling collapsed, which is a particularly extreme form of degradation whereby ecosystem processes supporting an ecosystem stratum have failed or transformed to such an extent that the stratum could no longer persist, even if you replanted it. So we can then expand that out into this matrix, and this forms the basis of our template for creating forest and woodland models. And you can see from left to right, we have increasing modification in the overstory from reference to collapsed. And for each of these overstory classes, we have 4 understory classes increasing in modification from top to bottom. We've then also added in intensive land use states on the right, including crops, intensive pastures and so on. And these reflect the way these states are recognised in international systems, such as the System for Environmental Economic Accounting or the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology, while also maintaining their connection to their original ecosystem type. And at the workshop, the various working groups found this template to be a workable starting point for most forest and woodland types in Australia. Sometimes some of the states are considered unlikely or impossible in some systems, but these can easily be excluded at the downscaling stage. So before I move on to the templates for non-forest systems, I'll just demonstrate how the template can be used. So we first might remove states that are not relevant to our system or problem. And we can also divide states where further detail is required, leading to an ordered set of states like this. We can then build in transitions guided by a set of rules. And then we can describe the drivers of those transitions. So you can see this process is intended to facilitate a degree of consistency in choosing and ordering states and assigning transitions and drivers, while still allowing plenty of flexibility. And there is also endless possibilities to add more detailed breakdown of states and so on, as I showed earlier. And in particular, sometimes we need to represent what we call recovering stages. For example, when a transition takes a long time, we might want to recognise some intermediate stages. And these can be flagged in a simple way, such as these green dots, or represented in a more substantial way, such as this dotted box. And these are what we've used to allow for 25-year timeframes in the nature repair market, for instance. So now let's have a look at some non-forest ecosystems. Starting with shrublands. Here's an example of a shrubland that is predominantly made up of the shrub layer. But not all shrublands are composed just of the shrub layer. Kenopod shrublands, for example, typically have a diverse herbaceous ground layer as well. And sometimes we might also see emergent trees in shrublands. So when thinking about a template for shrublands, our shrublands group put forward the concept of recognising a dominant biomass layer for one axis of our template versus subsidiary layers for the second axis. So here again we have our forest and woodlands template, and in the same vein for shrublands we've put forward the same shape template, but in each state the shrub layer is treated as the dominant layer with other layers, i.e. in this case the herbaceous and tree layers, treated along the second axis. And that brings us to grasslands. Here's an example of a simple tussock grassland with just a herbaceous ground layer. But that's not always the case. We might also have scattered shrubs or trees in some tussock grasslands and also in hummock grasslands. And sometimes the trees are a very important part of those grasslands, even though they may be scattered. So for the grasslands template, we propose the following the same recipe as for forests and woodlands and shrublands, but putting the herbaceous layer on top with the woody layer as subsidiary. So I've just had time today to introduce our 3 primary templates, but alongside these, we're also characterising the attributes of the ecosystem states in terms of departure from a high integrity reference, using these to guide assignment of ecosystem condition scores, and establishing guides for identifying plausible transitions between pairs of states. And we're also developing some secondary templates to facilitating inclusion of greater detail where required, such as shrub and herbaceous layers in forest understories. So I'll end here by noting that we've now applied this approach in its various stages of evolution to 17 regional state and transition models for the nature repair market, as well as providing guidance for method development and international initiatives, such as guidelines for assessing ecosystem conversion policies. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Ella. I'm a PhD student just across the river at QUT. Among my wonderful supervisory team are David Tucker and David Rowlings, who you've both heard from today. I am very lucky in that some prior speakers today have given me a bit of a platform for my presentation, which deviates a little bit from the topics today. So our keynote speaker this morning talked about the growing interest of industry in the scientific data and infrastructure that is rapidly growing internationally and in Australia. And my PhD broadly looks at, okay, is there a potential for research infrastructure to supply data for industry sustainability needs? My focus is specifically our beef industry. But to answer that question, first we need to know what are the current data challenges that our beef industry is facing at the moment. So public criticism, as we're all aware, has led to the beef industry needing to demonstrate efforts to be more environmentally sustainable and to reduce the environmental impact of beef production. There is absolutely no shortage of mechanisms through which supply chain companies and beef customers can report on their environmental performance. So mandatory reporting, for example, the federal government has just implemented climate reporting for companies. It's being introduced over the coming years, starting with large companies and then working their way down to small and medium enterprises as well over time. Voluntary standards and goals, plenty of those, and that includes climate reporting that some companies might do without specific guidelines, just reporting on their total carbon footprint and stuff like that, and then credentials and certifications, which would include things like organic production. But all of those things rely on the same thing. They need data. So of course, it is all about the farm. It's estimated that 85% of greenhouse gas emissions from beef production occur at the farm level. And in Australia, so that map is a little bit out of date from 2010. So as you can imagine, the extent of grazing across the continent has probably increased since then. And with over 40,000 beef producers and an average farm size of 13,000 hectares, collecting data from the farm scale is no small feat. So to understand what challenges supply chain companies and beef purchasing customers have with reporting on farm-level sustainability. We need to know what exactly are those problems, right? And the way we do that is not as interesting as exploding stars or drones. It's me sitting down with people who work for these companies and just talking to them. So there's very few numbers in this presentation, and maybe I can wake everyone up a little bit with some social science. Ooh. So over a few months in the first year of my PhD, I spoke with different people, different walks of life, all involved in the beef industry. This is a rough table to kind of show the spread of different people that were involved in this study. So publicly listed companies, private companies of varying sizes, so large, small and medium enterprises. And then I also consulted several experts instead of just industry stakeholders to sort of verify what the industry stakeholders may be saying, and also a bit of a sounding board for my ideas as I go through and talk to these people and start to form my thoughts of, okay, I think I understand what's going on and I know what these problems are. So this is a very brief summary of some of the dominant challenges that the industry and expert stakeholders reported. All this is in a paper, my first paper, currently under peer review, so touch wood, that will be published soon, and then you can all read the extended version, which is not just 6 problems, but about 30, I'd say. So here they're summarised both in terms of challenges collecting data, where companies collect their own, and where they try and use existing data sources, so that's usually government data sets like the greenhouse gas inventory. That was one that was explicitly mentioned over time. And then also in Queensland, things like SLATs for forestry and land use and stuff like that. So I draw your attention first to this problem: who is going to pay for it? And that demonstrates quite an important breakdown between producers and industry. So I'll just reiterate, I did not talk to farmers as part of this study. My only contact with producers was through talking to companies that are what we call vertically integrated, so where they have direct line of sight between the producer, which then goes to the processor, which then goes to the customer, so on and so forth. But this who was going to pay for it, that was sort of, okay, the supply chain doesn't want to pay for it, farmers don't want to pay for it, and we kind of end up in this stalemate where not a lot of progress is being made in terms of the industry collecting their own new data, right? And now there were quite a few of us who spoke today who had explored the problems with terminology, right, and the proliferation of nomenclature, and this was definitely one of the key problems that both stakeholder groups expressed was no common language. There's 100 different terms for 100 different concepts, and it's really unclear what different metrics and data sets are actually trying to say. But then what I found over time was that because sustainability has become so politicized, is that there's a bit of a safety net in that ambiguity in language, right? So that was very interesting, and I don't talk about it today, but happy to cover what I call perverse outcomes, so where if we don't get this stuff right, this is how it could go really, really wrong. The limited scalability, so spatial and temporal scalability of data sets, was a massive problem as well, especially for Northern Australia, and regional context not being captured. So issues in perhaps Southern Australia are not applicable to Northern Australia, and there's a bit of frustration there where problems or progress being made is not being accurately recognised. And I will just speed up a little bit. So what we've learned is that because of the politicisation of sustainability, the industry sees this as not just a data problem, but as a communication problem. So one of the people I spoke to, he had this really brilliant quote. He said that there's a lot of data that does exist that the industry doesn't want to use because it doesn't tell the right story. And that, again, is one of those perverse outcomes that really we need to avoid. And I think by further looking at how we can leverage national infrastructure networks to provide high-quality data, we can perhaps help industry to overcome some of these data challenges. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Annisa Satyanti. I'm from ABERS, the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. And first of all, I'd like to begin the presentation by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia and their enduring and strong connections to country. So today I'll be sharing the work conducted at ABERS. So this is a collaborative work where we look at the forest-dwelling species and threats. Okay, so forest-dwelling species is a key element of our reporting, which is the Australia State of the Forest Reporting, or SOFR. So the report itself is a 5-yearly report, first published in 1998. And these reports provide reliable, consistent data for informing policy and programs such as the regional forest agreements, but also Australia's international commitment, for example, for the FAO Forest Resource Assessment and the UN SDGs. And our report covers whole aspect of biodiversity indicators, including ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity. And today I'm focusing on forest species. So in each SOFR publication, which is every 5 years, we also release or update a list of forest-dwelling species. And here we define forest-dwelling species as a species that may use a forest habitat for some or the whole part of its life. And in the current SOFR, we're trying to develop an assessment of forest-dwelling species by using a quantitative approach so that we have a consistent and objective assessment in developing the species. And for the first time, we also leverage national level data, for example, the species occurrence data from the LA and also forest cover from the National Forest Inventory. And this approach is new, and this is a departure from the previous methodology where we often use data from various sources, often with strong biases, for example, spatial or taxonomic bias. So, as you can see on the slide, these are the summary of the steps of the methods that we newly developed. I'll talk through the steps and also some challenges that we faced. So, in the new method, the first step is to get a candidate list of species. And for each species, we need to have a forest and non-forest records. And this was enabled by intersecting species occurrence data from ALA and spatial coverage of forests from the NFI. And as you can see there, for example, we had large data sets. So for example, for flora, we had 27,000 entries that we need to work with. And in our list, we aim to have a list that are unique, meaning there's no duplicates, but also the species needs to be native and not extinct. In ALA, if you're familiar with the data sets, you will see that they do not have native attributes integrated in the backbone. So we need to sort of develop a systematic way to filter these non-native species, for example. As you can also see there, and also has been described in earlier presentation by Tyler, for example, that the data often consists of duplicates or synonyms. So for example, here you can see the 4 Coronacilis species that we received are in fact not valid accepted names. So for those cases, we merge the records and then give them a new valid name. So for those 4 species of Coronacilis, we replace it with one name, Coronacilis densa. And this was enabled by national level datasets again, by datasets from the taxonomic authorities, from the AFD and the APC. So after we have a clean datasets where everything is unique, native, and extant, we applied a quantitative threshold. As I mentioned before, this is a key element in our new method that we introduce some quantitative parameters in assessing the species. So to be considered forest dwelling, for example, the species needs to have at least 1 records in forest or meet a taxon group specific threshold that we developed by multiple iterations, as you can see in the table there. We also refined the list based on species ecological descriptors that we had or searched from literature and also some experts consultation. And this is to ensure that those species did not meet the threshold is not directly checked out. So we have sort of confidence that we do not omit key species that are sometimes rare and don't have ALA records in the first place, for example. All right, so by following the method, we were able to produce forest dwelling species list for flora and fauna. And this is a summary. So for Australia, out of that 5,000 candidate list, we've identified around 1,800 forest dwelling fauna. And we also were able to break this down by jurisdiction. And similarly for flora, we've identified nationally nearly 14,000 forest dwelling flora. And Queensland is the state with the highest number of forest dwelling flora and fauna. So what does it mean? So for forest management, it's not only the knowledge of the abundance or the richness or the number of species that is important, but also what are the status of the species? How many of these species are threatened, for example, and what causes the decline of the populations? And that's why we want to understand that as well. And to be able to answer that, we did some threat analysis and we focused on the threatened forest dwelling taxa under the BBC Act. And we use, again, nationally curated data from the species profile and threat database from TQ, and also look at the conservation document for this taxa. But first, we developed the list of threatened forest dwelling taxa by intersecting the forest dwelling species list that we had before with the EBBC listed threatened taxa, and also include the threatened forest dwelling taxa not otherwise captured by this intersection. And from this, we've found or identified that as at 2021, we've got 244 threatened forest dwelling fauna and 983 threatened forest dwelling flora. So across this threatened taxa, we then did threat analysis by looking at the conservation documents for those taxa and classify or categorize those threats into 11 threat categories and also give them rate, primary, secondary, and tertiary based on the severity of impact and also likelihood. And these categories and rating was based on the previous work at ABERS and also consistent with our previous software reporting. And as you can see there are the 11 threat categories: land use change and forest loss and forestry operations are separated. So there are two different categories in SOFR, because land use change and forest loss are those associated with forest conversion, so complete forest loss, whereas forestry operation here refers to threats associated with timber harvesting and management of forest, remaining forest. And finally, we tallied the threats for these taxa, and then we found that, in summary, the prevalent threats for these threatened forest dwelling taxa are land use change and forest loss, unsuitable fire regime, and impacts from invasive introduced species, which are also the case for broader threatened species for Australia. And forestry operations is the least prevalent threat for this taxa. So what's next? So we know how many species are there, and this is important because this will be the baseline that inform forest management and conservation measures. But we also think that because SOFR is ongoing work, right? So we are thinking that in the future we'd like to explore and integrate other national level data sets, for example, from the Tern species index or later the invasive species index, and perhaps also include other layers in our analysis, so we do not only have jurisdiction, but also other things like land tenure and forest types to have a stronger, more nuanced understanding of how our forest species fare. And yes, I think that's it. I'm happy to take any questions later. Thank you.
Too bright. Good afternoon, all. I'm Krishna Lamsal. I'm research associate in remote sensing at University of Tasmania in Hobart. I'll be presenting results from our project. I team with Dr. Lucia, professor from University of Tasmania, and then acknowledgements to Tern landscape teams and Ben Sparrow. We have heard or in a way discussed quite a bit about data gaps today, too much data, too little data, and how we in a way could work collaboratively to fill the data gaps. My presentation is not on that one, but is more focused on open source, free analysis-ready data sets that is available for all of us, and we can access it, and then we can generate some meaningful insights from the data. So yeah, for Australia, there's quite a lot of free open source data sets that we can freely access and use the way we want. And from that data set, we can generate quite a bit of meaningful info that in a way can be used for ecological applications, field planning, forest management, and so on and so on. So why is that important? Definitely for continental scale long-term monitoring of the ecosystems. And what that does is that enables us to detect, attribute, and model the change happening in any site or any location. So focusing that in mind, so current work focuses on accessing and analyzing analysis-ready data sets using some sort of cloud-native geospatial workflows and tools, and then produce and visualize those matrices, either trend seasonal matrices, and visualize them in like a user-friendly tool that anyone can click a point and then see what happened in that part or in that area or that plot, and then can attribute that to some sort of, let's say, disturbance like fire, drought, or whatever things that might have happened in the past. How do I go back? No. Can I go back, please? Yep, thank you. Yeah, it's covered a bit of adrenaline rush. Okay. The study sites, we now focused all OSPLOT sites, that's 987 OSPLOT sites distributed across the country. And then we characterized temporal and seasonal dynamics of all those plots. So data source and infrastructure, we used Digital Earth Australia's analysis-ready datasets, basically the Landsat-derived fractional vegetation cover product and Sentinel-2, and from that Sentinel-2 we computed spectral indices, normalized difference vegetation index, normalized difference moisture index, normalized bond ratio, which in a way indicate different biochemical or biophysical traits of vegetation. So we access that through STAC, Spatio-Temporal Asset Catalog. There are some developed tools which you can use to access data set, and then we compile the data sets, all the plots. We specially clip them to fit to the OSPLOT sites. Then we maxed out shadows and clouds and contaminated pixels. Then in spatio-temporal aggregation to compute a monthly median of the indices or PB fraction, and then do further analysis. Let's say like evaluate if there is like a monotonic increase or decrease in the trend, and then use Bayesian ensemble algorithms to identify change points and see and also evaluate the probability of that change or chance of that event being occurred. So yeah, it's some sort of like so it's like time series thing, and we computed those matrices, which I will present. So it's like a user-friendly interactive platform that that can be accessed, and we can evaluate and see how the plots have been changing over the past decades. This is for photosynthetic vegetation covers. I mean, like in fractional vegetation cover, we have three components: green component, non-green component, and bare soil. PB of photosynthetic vegetation includes like the green cover, and the plot shows the mean PB fraction of all those plot sites, and then on the plot, this one shows the trend of Mann-Condell trend. I mean, like monotonic increase or decrease trend of the photosynthetic vegetation fraction from 2010 to end of 2024. Just to give a snapshot of few sites, two sites, one in Calpram and one in Sydney Basin, with a different PB percentage, roughly 19 and 61.5. So if we go to a site in Calpram super site, this is how the time series of photosynthetic vegetation looks like. We can see there's quite a bit of like greening happening around 2012 and 13, and a bit of drop in 2014. We can in a way attribute that to some sort of disturbances that have happened on that site. So there was a fire passing through the site in 2014. Another way of presenting that data in a different way, to visualize it in a different form. And then some matrices that in a way quantify the trend, seasonality, breakpoints, and the probability of breakpoints being happened. And the other way to visualize, same way with the other side in Sydney Basin, a big drop. We all know 2019-20 bushfire with that big drop. Other way of presenting the data, and the same like information that we can generate from those time series. It's also done with like spectral indices derived from a Sentinel-2 dataset from 2019 to 2024. We have generated like same mean NDVI, mean NDMI, and mean NBR, and the Mann-Condell trains of all those OSPLOT sites. This is like a visualization that we can see per plot if we click a site, and then can see how the plot look like, trend look like, and so on. It wasn't that slow in my computer, but I mean, like, what I want to show here is like, yeah, okay, we can see at least one plot. Okay, those plots. If we click our plot side, we can see those all sort of like things happening, and then like we in a way can attribute all those changes to the events or whatever we have observed in the past. Similarly, for those same sites with the plots NDVI, NDMI, and NBR, and the same ways of different ways of showing the plots, spiral plot and Bayesian interval algorithm-based time series segmentation. For Sydney Basin site, we can see the bushfire impact there, and the same other plots. Yeah, so I mean, like, what basically the message here is we have a lot of analysis-ready data sets that we can access and use that would in a way enable us to facilitate cross-ecosystem comparisons and support reproducible assessments of long-term vegetation dynamics in Australian context. So basically a prototype of scalable open access infrastructure in terms of like having open source code and other things is available that in a way can help to derive some meaningful info for ecosystems management and decision support applications. And also those informations could be synthesized in a different way that could in a way lead to better field planning, or where do we go, or which site to focus to monitor and map, and so on and so on. The data repo is there. My email if you have any questions or clarifications. I don't know if my QR code still works. If not, that's my LinkedIn profile. Yep, happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so my name's Rochelmeyer. I'll also be speaking with Peter Fitch, and we're part of the Ecological Knowledge System, or the EKS, which is a partnership between CSIRO and TQ, and it supports the nature repair market. So a major part of the EKS is state and transition models. Suzanne went into a lot of detail about state and transition models, or STMs, earlier, so I'm not going to repeat that. I hope you're paying attention, though. What we will be talking about, though, is how you actually go about creating these state and transition models and how you manage the data behind them. So usually, there we go. You start off with a workshop. You get all the experts into one room and you ask them what they know about an ecosystem and their dynamics and the management. And then you end up with a beautiful model and a data set and database. Obviously, it's easier said than done. Expert knowledge is data, but it is quite messy. And our workshop output can look like this. So how do you actually capture this knowledge and formalise it in a way that it can be retrieved and analysed? So the EKS team, over a series of 4 workshops and 17 models, has developed a series of standardised steps, tools and workflows to create state and transition models. So I'll be talking about 5 key tools that we use to create these state and transition models, and then Peter will continue describing the data model that supports all this work. So our first tool are the national templates, and the main one is that modified states template that Suzanne mentioned earlier. So as a quick recap, this describes all the possible states your ecosystem could be in with different combinations of overstory and understory condition, ranging from reference to collapsed or transformer. So we give this template to our experts and we ask them, which of these states is relevant for your region and which ones can we just ignore? Our next tool is, unfortunately, yes, Excel. We can't get away from it. So once the experts have decided on those modified states, we then ask them to quantify attributes related to each of those states. We have made it a bit easier. We've pre-filled standard ranges that come with those templates. And then we ask for some regionally specific attributes. So those might be your dominant species in your canopy, mid-story, ground layer, as well as vegetation cover in each of those layers. But I'll agree that that's pretty boring. And it's just your luck that next step's not a lot better, because we then have to go to Word. We take those attributes, and then we have to summarise them into a beautiful description for our report. So for each of those states, we have a description and summary of those attributes. Except we have to do that about 16 times for each of those models, which I don't know about you, but I did not want to do. So that brings us to our next tool, which is AI. So yes, we've joined the cool kids. So we still take those 16 or so attribute sheets and then convert them into the report format. But this time we do it the easy way with a combination of Python scripting and AI. So we've generated a series of prompts that pulls out that information from those spreadsheets and converts it into our report format. So this task used to take us days of work. Now it can be done in a matter of minutes. So it's a time saver, but it also helps ensure consistency because we can ensure the exact same attributes are talked about in the same order. So it helps us be consistent across all our models. Our next tool is Google Sheets. There are several key benefits to using Google Sheets, but the main one I want to focus on is the scripting. So we've generated an STM toolbox, which is a series of customized scripts that helps support us to create and manage this STM data. So up in the top right corner, I've got a face here, we've got a reference state and a couple of modified states. There's a simplified state and transition model. Our first question is, can you actually go from your reference state to modified state 1? Is this possible or is it not possible? So what our first script does is it generates all possible combinations of starting and end states. It assigns a unique transition ID with reference to our database, and then it asks, is that transition possible? And it enforces a 0 or 1 data type. So next, you have a plausible transition. Congratulations. Your next question is, how? How do you go from your reference state to modified state 1? So what our next script does is it pulls out all those plausible transitions, and then it asks us to assign drivers. And we do that using another script. So we can search a master data list for a driver to assign to this transition. So here I've searched for fire, and it comes up with all the drivers related to fire, which I then click and assign to that transition. And that brings me to the final tool I want to talk about, which is our driver catalogue. So this is a master list of transition drivers, which has been refined over a series of workshops. It currently has about 140 drivers ranging from clearing and climate to soil and vegetation, and there's potential to add new ones as we go. So what this driver list really does, it helps us be consistent in how we're describing drivers and transitions between our models. So those are 5 key tools that we use to create STMs. I'll pass to Peter now, who will describe the data model supporting this work. Okay.
Hey everybody. It's always dangerous doing a bit of a tag team, but we're hoping it's going to work. So at the end of the process, we end up with a whole heap of data, and at the heart of a useful data set is a data model. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data model that we've developed for state and transition model data, some of the problems that we encountered in our standardised workflow that forced us down this road, the description of the model, how we used it to provide data to the planner tool, and where to from here. So a data model, many of you in this room will know, is a formal representation of a domain, the concepts and the attributes that you care about associated with those concepts. And it has a number of benefits, including it provides an organising framework for your data and then leads to benefits of data integrity and data quality because your data is organised and potentially stored in a standard way. It provides a clarity of purpose and use for your data, leading to an ability to document and govern your data as well, using things like version control and change management processes. And more importantly, it does allow you a standardised way to exchange and use your data. So we encountered a range of problems as we went through that elicitation process, and we've tried to minimise those with standardised tooling. But you can imagine the sorts of problems that we encountered where the states themselves were identified by a string, a name, prior to having a unique identifier. we had inconsistent use of those identifiers and descriptors. And so for the same thing, we often had a couple of different labels for the same thing. We had an inability to reuse definitions and terms within our data that we were collecting. The assignment of identifiers I've talked about a moment ago, there was no standardised way of doing that. And that whole process leading to the ultimate data set was, I guess, a cascade of these small and difficult problems. And at the end, we needed to push that data into the planner tool. So the model that we developed basically has three concepts. It's got a high-level concept we call the model core, which consists of a state and transition model metadata and the states and transitions themselves. The second part is a causal chain, which you can think about as a package of drivers. And lastly, some concepts around the method alignment for nature repair projects. We're in the process of preparing a technical report, and we're hoping that this is published very soon. Moving down from the conceptual view, there's a logical and a physical view of the data model. This is just illustrative. We don't expect you to read it, but you can see for the model itself, the metadata, and within the states and transition elements, the sorts of things that are included in the model. On the right-hand side, the physical view is an implementation view for a database that describes not only the elements, but the data types, and provides a description of those as well. This is where we put the model to work. We generated the data sets from the elicitation process and used JSON to transfer the data to the planner system. We use JSON because it's a widely used representation with many tools. But more importantly, it's easy to read for a person, so you can open it up with a text editor and you can see what the attributes are and you can read them. And we found that, coupled with a Git repo, worked very well at the end of that process to get the data to the planner team. So what's next? As I mentioned a moment ago, this work is in the process of being written up. We're putting the data model on GitHub, on the Ecological Knowledge System repo. So that'll be available, including the scripts that we use to manipulate the model. And we're hoping that we can leverage this work to build a cloud database and API to serve out the state and transition models that are being developed as part of this project.
Thank you. So what's next for the state and transition models? Well, we're hoping for a bit of integration with Tern. So on one hand, STMs could ingest Tern data, so that data could be used to build and validate state and transition models. And then going the other way, state and transition models could be a new data source to Tern, bringing in expert knowledge and a predictive capacity. And if you're interested in creating your own state and transition model, do keep your eye out for our upcoming guide to the expert elicitation of state and transition models. So that's it from us. Happy to take any questions afterwards, or you can send us an email at eks@siro.au. Thank you very much.
Can I get the speakers to come up and sit up front?
Questions so far?
Yeah. Sure. Great. Thanks for a great array of talks. In setting them up, I discussed about, I didn't think we were going to talk about data, and I think you've lived up to that. We've talked about how to extract information, knowledge, wisdom, etc. out of data in what I'd suggest it might even be revolutionary ways. So I think there's some really exciting work that's happened by the team here. I've got a few questions, and Suzanne's there as well, that's awesome. A couple of questions that have come in, and then I've certainly got some of my own I might quiz you with as well. So we'll start with you, Suzanne, online. Someone's asked here, how closely does your definition of collapse align with the Red List of Ecosystems definition?
So we drew that definition from David Keith's paper in 2013 and then added some clarifying points. So I would say we're aiming to align very closely in this methodology with existing global methods, including IUCN and the CIA in terms of reference states, and also I didn't get time today to talk about how we're assigning conditions to the states, but we are also working with the Society for Ecological Restoration Recovery Wheel to align the state and transition models as best we can with that.
Thanks, Suzanne. And one for you, Simon. Briefly, what did you mean by alpha and beta diversity?
Okay, in simple terms, alpha diversity is essentially the richness of biodiversity at an individual location. So that could be, in terms of the most basic version of alpha diversity, that's just the number of species occurring at a given location. Beta diversity is the difference in composition between two locations. So again, in the simplest version of beta diversity, it is a measure of the overlap or distinctiveness in the lists of species occurring at two different locations.
Thank
Is
you.
that enough?
That's awesome. Suzanne and Simon, you have got very lucky because the audience asked questions, so you won't get to be subjected to my questions, but the rest of you have got a few questions for you. Ella, I worked with on a project with social scientists recently, and it just blew my mind. It just changed how I view what I do. You had a whole lot of technical impediments to environmental monitoring and reporting. Would you like to comment on what you think is perhaps the biggest social impediment to reporting for farmers?
I think it's kind of captured in what I discussed around who was going to pay for it is the cost, obviously, is a massive barrier, but farmers having to report on their environmental performance is a bit like if someone followed me around with a camera and was like, how many single-use plastics did you use today? Right, so it's a bit exposing, and of course a lot of privacy concerns and autonomy concerns in a way, if it can lead to more regulations, is obviously a big social aspect that needs to be considered when we're talking about policing and reporting farmers' activities, and there is only so much that can be done on environmental impacts, like the impacts of drought and extreme climate events will of course have massive impacts on environments on farms that can only be controlled so much by what the farmer is doing, and that's where I think terms like resilience can be more important rather than sustainability, and I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you. Annisa, in your presentation, it struck me as you're doing this reporting every 5 years on the state of the forests. Would you or any colleagues have any comments on how that's changed and if that's become easier now we're starting to look at data federally as an infrastructure activity?
So for most of our indicators, we still supplied by data from state and territories and other partners. But for the specific species indicators, including the forest-dwelling species list, this is a new approach that we have taken recently because some of the reasons, including varying data quality from varying data sources and some biases that I mentioned in the presentation. So currently we're looking at national level data sets for the species indicators, but I think there are other indicators that also use national level data in collaboration with DQ, for example, for carbon and other things.
Thank you. Krishna, I've had the luxury of being able to quiz you about your work before, so... One of the things that struck me, though, from your presentation that we haven't chatted about is historically remote sensing's really excelled in where's change occurring. But you've really come up with a way to wring out some really intriguing information on when that change is happening. And also being able to somewhat go back in time and see how that change is happening. Can you comment on that, how that's changed through time?
Yes, with the temporal data we have, we can in a way get a snapshot of the event or whatever disturbance have happened in the past, and then can link it. Just like in one of the plots I have shown, either in Calprum or in the Sydney Basin site. So there was a clear dip in the temporal trajectory, and that in a way indicated some sort of disturbance. So it was a very, very sharp decline. So that means it should be a rapid disturbance, something like a fire or a clear felling or whatever thing. So I mean, like we can also in a way attribute the disturbance whether it's like a drought, which in a way difficult to predict, but we can in a way see a very subtle declining trend in vegetation trends or greenness trends. And then we can go back and then see or probably find some reports from previous field visits and experts or in a way prior info, and then link it to what actually have happened. And in other contexts, we can also do some sort of forward modeling of the time series and then predict what and how time series may look like for the next couple of years. It comes with some sort of uncertainty, but it in a way gives us like an idea how it will go, provided no disturbances are there. I mean, business as usual sort of cases. We can in a way go to the future and see. But if, let's say, a fire happens or something happens, it would be a different thing.
Awesome, thank you. And Ellen and Peter, one of the things that struck me from your work was you standardised data collection and everything got easy after that. Like that enabled you to increase accuracy, automate, and get better products out. So I wonder if you got some comments about how critical it is to, at that creation, start at that end of the story, controlling things and what that enables downstream.
It definitely makes things more efficient. It's so easy in these big workshops to just go around in circles and not get anywhere in your conversations. So having these templates to start off in your workshop definitely helps make things more efficient. Yeah.
It's super important to standardise as much as you can, and I guess my sense is that the workshop itself is you're trying to capture knowledge from a range of experts in the best possible way you can to lead to, I guess, a quality representation of that knowledge. And what we found is having the lack of standardised process actually slowed the workshop down. So we didn't get as far down the track as we could have, having a room full of 25 experts. So it has that added benefit as well, not only quality, but the timeliness to get more out of the time that you've got with the experts has been very helpful as well.
All right, thank you. Can you join me in thanking our speakers today for an awesome series of presentations? And I think I hand over to Beryl now to say and wrap us up for the day.
Into the last straits. Ellen Rochelmeyer said in her talk a moment ago that it was really cool to use AI. I want to tell you that for those that were in the room when we started the day and we showed our videos, that Tern was using AI in 2010, except we were calling it alien intelligence. Fabulous day, I think. I've been getting lots of texts from people saying how much they're enjoying it. So congratulations, everyone in the audience. I don't want to hold you up because I know you've been a fabulous audience, being very patient and participating. I do want to say a few things about tonight, because I have picked up in the breaks that some people aren't necessarily aware that you're invited to a reception tonight from 6:30 to 8:30 next door in the Queensland Museum, where we're doing a celebration of... but you have to come along to find out what the celebration is. But what's really interesting is that there is drink and there is finger food, and lots of us to talk to. Well, I hope there will be if you come. So do come. Don't get all snuggled up somewhere nice and warm and decide it's too much to come along. The doors will open at 6:30 at the museum, and there will be some short speeches at 7 o'clock. Drinks will be there straight up, but the food will start at 7. But don't be late. Okay, I'm going to call an end to this. We kick off tomorrow at 10 to 9, and we've got another really excellent program for you tomorrow. So I'll see you then. Bye.